Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for The Leftovers Season 3, Episode 5. It's a Matt world. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of The Leftovers, so I'll have to start by giving a spoiler warning for The Leftovers up to Season 3, Episode 5. If you haven't seen up to this point, you may not want to watch this video, otherwise some things may be spoiled for you. So I was actually very skeptical about this episode as I knew it was going to be a Matt-centric episode, and last year's Matt-centric episode was my least favorite episode of the entire series, partly because it was simply a rehash of Matt's Season 1 episode, so I was really concerned that this episode would be yet another rehash of the same story of Matt trying to accomplish something, but he keeps getting obstacle after obstacle thrown in his way. But thankfully, that's not what this episode was, and it was not a tired rehash. In fact, I think it was incredibly original. And I'd even go as far to say that this is my favorite Matt episode of the show. Mind you, I wasn't quite as big of a fan of the Season 1 episode as most people were, but I still thought that this was a surprisingly powerful episode. So the episode begins right with answering a big question that was asked in last week's episode, which ended with Kevin learning that all the airports were shut down because of an explosion. So the big question was, what explosion? What is this explosion? And the episode immediately begins by showing us what happened with a French nuclear submarine in the South Pacific, and we see a man strip naked and steal the keys to set off the nuclear bomb. This was a pretty well executed and exciting scene. It was a great way to open the episode. It was pretty cool seeing the guy had to do this fancy yoga move to turn one key with his foot and the other with his hand. So I think this was just a guy gone crazy by the upcoming 7th anniversary of the departure. I think he just was acting alone, and he's just one crazy guy. We later learned that the bomb went off in an uninhabited island in the Pacific and no one was hurt. So at first I was a bit confused as to why all travel would be shut down because of one nuclear explosion in the South Pacific, as the French used to do nuclear testing and nuclear explosions in the South Pacific all of the time and no one cared. But I suppose the freak out here is because it wasn't a sanctioned blast and was just one crazy guy who managed to do it without permission. And I suppose some governments may not believe the French government's insistence that this wasn't a sanctioned explosion, and it could raise the international tension level. And when we hear Matt talking to someone on the airline over the phone, we hear him arguing with him saying, "What, do you think the French are starting a war with the English?" Which kind of brings up the absurdity of it because, but I think they're just worried that it was terrorists or some other organized group responsible, that perhaps more attacks like this could be on the way. Regardless, I do find it a bit far-fetched that they would, be so stingent, like shutting down all air travel, it seems like across the world, or at least in Australia, and it seems like in America as well, and to the point of not even letting relief planes land in Melbourne. I'm just not quite buying this, but who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is how they would really react. So we get to Matt after the incident occurred, as we start off with him trying to get a member of his congregation that has access to relief plane to fly them to Australia. This did surprise me a bit, as I thought we might backtrack a bit to see a bit more of what Matt had been up to while the events of the previous episodes took place, but no, instead we jump right into this, and actually I kind of prefer this as we just get on with it. And so Matt manages to convince this guy with a big old pile of money to leave his sick mother behind and go off on some half-cocked adventure to Australia. Of course, I did get the impression that the pilot only did it because it was Matt and he was one of his devoted followers, and he actually convinced himself it was for a noble or holy purpose, just the way he was like, so it's a rescue mission, and Matt's like, sure, yeah, that's it, a rescue mission. But really it's just Matt going off on his crazy beliefs that Kevin needs to be in Miracle on the 7th anniversary in order to prevent the apocalypse. So they go to get on the plane, and it was Matt's intention to bring John John and Michael with him, but Laurie shows up there as well, and he's not so on board with this because Laurie doesn't believe in what they believe in about Kevin being this savior figure. And I like the argument that they have, as Laurie wants to go because she's concerned about Kevin's mental health, and she thinks Matt is responsible for this mental breakdown by trying to convince him he's some sort of savior. And I absolutely loved Matt's retort when he asked Laurie if she has her whistle because she needs to blow off some steam. This, of course, was a callback to season 1 where Laurie was part of the guilty remnant and Matt was trying to read them, service or, whatever to them, and Laurie came up and blew her whistle to shut him up. And of course, that remark hit a little too close to home as Laurie still deeply regrets her time in the remnant, so that sent her off the handle. But thankfully, John was there to calm the situation down. But it's funny how good Matt is at provoking people. When you think of him, you typically think of like a religious man with good intention, but he's actually really good at being passive-aggressive sometimes and getting under people's skin. So because of John and Michael sticking up for her, Matt lets Laurie come along, but they continue arguing all along the way. It's interesting, though, that throughout the entire journey, John and Michael continue to stick up for Laurie despite the fact that she doesn't believe in what they do, whereas Matt constantly butts heads with her because he considered her opinion mindless psychobabble, where she considers his opinion fantastical nonsense. In fact, a big draw of this episode is the inherent conflict between Matt and Laurie and how they ultimately respect each other, but they have different beliefs in this matter and that are just at odds. But John and Michael were more respectful of her different beliefs and felt that she could still play a role in their quest. And overall, John and Michael seemed to be more open-minded and amenable to change, whereas Matt was just stuck in his ways. As when they arrive in Australia, they are not permitted to land in Melbourne and are diverted to Tasmania. Now, realistically, I'm sure it could have been possible for them to be diverted somewhere on the mainland rather than having to go to an offshore island, but then that wouldn't allow them to do this story about going on a boat. So they go take this ferry from Tasmania to Melbourne, which would take 11 hours, but it's all booked out by a private party, so Matt goes to apply to this private party and they refuse to take money, so Matt appeals to their sense of charity, but then she reveals there will be sex on the boat, a lot of it, and asks if they'll be okay with that, and he says yes, absolutely, but she doesn't believe him, so she asks him to tell the dirtiest joke that he knows. Laurie tries to step in, but she doesn't let her. She wants to hear Matt say it, so Matt manages to tell a dirty joke that satisfies her, and the butt of the joke is about priests molesting children. It's interesting that the joke he knows is a self-deprecating joke about priests. Most likely it stuck with him because he found it personally offensive, which is why he was able to recall it, but he uses it for the greater purpose of getting to Kevin as soon as possible. He's also able to ignore the giant orgy going on around him as random people are simply having sex everywhere. Another thing he surely doesn't approve of, but the most important thing to him is getting to Kevin. So I'm not sure how I feel about this group of people who took over the boat. I suppose you could call them a sex cult. I mean, we've seen all sorts of other cults on the show, so sure, why not a sex cult? I'm pretty sure some will complain that this is yet another excuse for HBO to have a lot of sex and nudity in their shows, but I saw it more as an attempt to be absurd, as Matt episodes tend to be absurd. So this cult in particular was based off of a lion named Fraser, who at the age of 91 impregnated a bunch of lionesses in a den where none of the lions were breeding, so they essentially used this as an excuse to have a bunch of sex. So that's fine. I mean, there are groups like this, so I didn't find this particularly unrealistic. Absurd maybe, but believable. What did bother me, though, was the whole thing about after midnight you can't say his name lest you become him. When she first said that, I was like, okay, that sounds ridiculous, but whatever. But the scene where Matt actually did say it, this really bothered me, as it felt so contrived. In fact, this was the only scene in the entire episode that reminded me of the poor, contrived quality of storytelling in Matt's Season 2 episode. In fact, this scene felt a lot like the whole scene where that guy got Matt to hit him with the paddle while yelling Brian, which was, just pretentious bullshit nonsense. Of course, for one, why does this crazy shit always happen to Matt? Why is he the one that always gets taken over by crazy nonsensical people? And for two, just the whole reason thing about Matt, saying Frasier felt really fake. It felt like an obvious screen-written moment. Like the writers are like, we have to have Matt say Frasier, so they'll perform this crazy ceremony. So let's just have him say it here. And it didn't feel natural. It didn't seem to fit. It didn't seem realistic. But and especially considering how many times Matt had been warned to not say it. He wasn't sure what would happen if he did, but he still, he could tell how crazy and nonsensical these people were, so it seems like something that he'd want to avoid. And the whole ritual was a bit silly, that they happened to have this entire mock lion at the ready just in case someone says Frasier. And I bet half the people there didn't give a fuck about these rituals and were just there to have sex. I mean, seriously, some of these people were right in the middle of having sex. You think they'd stop just to go do this stupid ritual? Now that I find really far-fetched. So this was the only scene in the episode that lived up to what I was worried this episode would be. But having said that, it was just one scene, so it didn't ruin the entire episode for me. In fact, I did like the fact that Matt's little outburst revealed that there was a saboteur in their midst who was there undercover as she went up to Matt to tell him that he's not alone in thinking that these people are sick. Now, I heard some speculation on who these people were. Some people thinking they were animal rights activists, but I thought it was quite clear that they were religious fanatics that had a problem with all the sex, because their ultimate plan was clearly to unleash the lion on these people and have the lion kill them. So I'm not sure that, they probably had found a sense of irony in that, as well as having these people killed by the thing that they worship. But they knew that such an action would lead to a lion being killed, which, by the way, is exactly what happens. So definitely not animal rights activists. And just the way one woman talked to Matt saying these people are sick made me believe it was about the sex, and that was the problem they had with it. So now let me get to David Burton. Before the season started, I expected him to show up in episode 4 when Kevin went to Melbourne, and when he didn't show up there, I was doubting whether or not we'd see him at all this season. So David Burton was mentioned throughout season 2 as a guy in Australia who died and came back to life, and a lot of people believed him to be some sort of savior. And during Kevin's time in the afterlife, he ran into a man with an Australian accent, first on the bridge where he tried to stop Kevin from throwing Patty down the well, and then in the karaoke bar where he instructed Kevin on how to get back to the world of the living. Many speculated that this man we saw in the afterlife was David Burton. In fact, it was pretty well established assumption by the time season 3 started, but this episode is in fact the first confirmation that it is in fact the same person. However, I wasn't the tiniest bit surprised. But the big question in my mind is, does this David Burton remember his time in the afterlife with Kevin? That's the question I know we're likely never going to get an answer to, but it's something interesting to think about. In fact, during this episode, I kept waiting for Matt to find out that David Burton was involved in Kevin's afterlife experience, because I thought it would have been interesting, but it never happened. And I didn't mind that it didn't happen, because I was happy with what they did do. I just thought it would have been interesting because Matt was being a bit hypocritical, as he was so dismissive of Burton's claims of coming back from the dead and becoming a savior, while at the same time promoting Kevin as a savior because he was coming back from the dead. And it was a bit frustrating how that irony was completely lost on him. But the big difference between David Burton and Kevin is Kevin still thinks of himself as a normal person, and in fact doesn't really talk about his experiences, whereas David Burton goes around calling himself God and made it public to the point where he became some sort of celebrity. So I suppose what David Burton lacks is a sense of being humble, and the fact that he thinks and acts like he is God does in fact come off as smug and pompous. But still, that didn't diminish the irony in the fact that Matt was so angry about David Burton's blasphemy in pretending to be God, when he in fact is doing the exact same thing by creating a new Messiah with Kevin. So it was interesting how David Burton had these cards he handed out that were full of the frequently asked questions, so he didn't have to talk to anyone and have the same conversations over and over again. You can kind of get that he'd be sick of getting asked the same questions all the time, but still there's something really pompous about that, like, oh, I'm too good to talk to you, so here's my card. This apparently was based off of what the actor who played Biff from Back to the Future, Thomas F. Wilson, was doing as he started handing out cards that answered everyone's questions that he was sick of being asked. So that's when, David Burton really started pissing Matt off, but it got worse when he saw him throw someone off the boat, and no one would, no one believed Matt that this was actually what happened. So when Matt tried to confront him, he just got punched in the gut. So he goes to John and Michael for help, but they insist Laurie be a part of the conversation too. I love how when Matt suggests that they compel David Burton to confess, he quotes the Bible, some line about reaping what you sow, and John was like, "We're not reaping anyone, man." I just laughed out loud at that. That was a great line. But then somehow the conversation deteriorated into Matt telling John and Michael that Kevin told Laurie he saw Evie in Australia, which was a huge asshole thing to do. And I love John's reaction where he said he understood why Laurie didn't tell him and that he wouldn't have told him either, the implication being that Matt shouldn't have told him. So at that moment, Matt knew that he had lost John and Michael's support and that they wouldn't help him and were in fact pissed off at him. So he reasoned his best course of action was to agree with them and tell them that he was going to go and get some rest. But I knew he wasn't simply going to get some rest, and I knew he wasn't going to let this go. And sure enough, next thing we see of him, he goes to the medical bay to get a wheelchair, and then he gets an axe and he proceeds to knock David Burton out with the handle of the axe, and then ties him to the wheelchair and takes him down to the cargo hold to have a conversation with him. And this conversation went very differently than I expected. I'm convinced that David Burton actually believes that he is God. Laurie would refer to it as like a psychological condition, but regardless, I don't think he's lying or putting on an act. I believe he believes what he's saying. Now, what adds a very interesting element to it is that we know that David Burton does have an actual element of supernatural power, as we saw him in the afterlife give Kevin much needed instructions. And just like his appearance in this episode, he did come off as someone who was wise and had all the answers. But does that mean I think he's God? No, of course not. But I don't think he's just some crazy person either, as he does have some special abilities. In fact, some could look at him as another Kevin. But again, The Leftovers does an amazing job of presenting us with something seemingly crazy, but making the audience doubt whether or not it is crazy. This season has been doing this more than any other season, and has been doing a great job at it, as this show has always been about the struggle between science and faith, or exploring the gray area in between. And so this device forces the audience to question what is real and what is in the fantasy world, and it's absolutely great. But of course, what's really interesting about this conversation is that it appears at some point Matt actually believes that David Burton is God, because he starts talking to him like he is God and eventually even lets him go. I think that Matt used him as a surrogate to talk to God, because whether or not he was God or that he actually believed he was God, he used it as a way to talk to God and have a conversation with him. And to his credit, David Burton's responses were actually very wise when Matt said that he did all these things, such as letting his family go for him, for God. And his response was, no, you did it for yourself, which is probably dead right. So regardless of whether or not he is God, or regardless of whether or not Matt believes he is God, this was a very spiritual experience for Matt that obviously affected him greatly. So the big piece of information we learn in this scene is that Matt is sick and and dying. It is implied he has leukemia, which he apparently had as a child but was able to beat it, and now it's back. This was hinted at in episode 3, where Matt appeared to be really sick, and all throughout this episode he kept getting nosebleeds and vomiting. And it's interesting that David Burton gets Matt to let him go by promising that he can heal him and take his sickness away. And Matt surprisingly goes along with this. And once Matt started untying him, I half expected him to just punch Matt in the face and run. But instead he simply snaps his fingers and says, "Ta-da! You're saved." I must admit, I laughed really hard at that. That was a richly absurd line. In fact, I thought the whole scene was amazing. One of the most powerful scenes The Leftovers has ever done. And the fact that it was so absurd only added to the power of the scene. So next thing we see, they're arriving in Melbourne, and the whole time I was thinking that Matt forgot all about that woman who told him to stay in the boat when they arrived, as I thought she was going to set off a bomb or something. But yeah, Matt didn't tell anyone about her, so I thought he just forgot about her. But he did in fact stay behind on the boat with John, Michael, and Laurie, so maybe he didn't. And apparently they found the body in the water, so they finally believed Matt about David Burton killing someone. So the police arrived to arrest David Burton, who made a run for it right when those saboteurs released the lion, so the lion went straight for him and killed him. This does make me wonder, if their plan was to kill that sex cult, shouldn't they have realized that the lion would go after the dude running and not the sex cult? And shouldn't the fact that the police were there give them pause? But apparently not. But I dare say that this isn't the last that we've seen of David Burton, and I expect, and in fact hope, that we see more of him in the afterlife, but we'll see. But the important thing about the ending is that Matt told the captain that he had no pressing business in Melbourne, which means his experience with David Burton has changed his mind. Now, whether or not this means he no longer thinks Kevin as the savior, or he simply accepted the fact that they're not going to make it back to Miracle in time for the anniversary, I'm not sure, but I'm leaning towards the latter. I think Matt still believes in Kevin, but has accepted what Michael was trying to get him to accept earlier, that whatever was going to happen in the anniversary was going to happen in Australia. And of course he tells the others that he's dying. However, it will be interesting to see if he actually does die, because if he doesn't, it could be interpreted as David Burton saving him, but we'll see. It was a great way to end the episode when, after David Burton got mauled by the lion, Matt simply turned to the others and said, "Oh, that was the man I was telling you about." Such a richly absurd ending, which was made even greater by the music that came on after it. But Matt's nonchalantness does make me believe he didn't really think David Burton was God, even though he was behaving like he was earlier. I think he simply saw him as a surrogate, a way to have a conversation with God. So my rating for It's a Matt World out of 10 is an 8, extremely good. I was tempted to give this episode a 9 because Matt's conversation with David Burton was immensely powerful scene, and the ending had a perfect twinge of absurdity to it, as well as I really enjoyed Matt and Laurie's interactions in this episode, but it did have some moments of contrived hokiness that reminded me of a lesser Matt episodes of the past, so I do have to take that into account. But overall, yet another great episode in Season 3. So that's it for my review of It's a Matt World. Be sure to check back here every week as I continue to review episodes of The Leftovers. Also be sure to check out my channel as I do many more videos on shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Better Call Saul, Sense8, The 100, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all that. And thanks a lot for watching.